We're gonna give it 3 or 4 minutes, and then the session on Scotland will start shortly afterwards. Could somebody do me a big favor and tell me if they can see my screen?
I can see the
Yes.
screen.
Yes, we can.
Amazing. Thank you so much, guys. Hi, everybody. My name's Bethany, and I'm going to be giving the pre-EUDC training session on understanding Scotland. Obviously, Euros is in Scotland this year, so it's very topical and a subject matter close to my heart. I trained at Glasgow for years and am originally from Aberdeen. And I'm going to keep this session focused on the material that is hard to matter prep. I'm sure lots of people on here are prepping for Euros and are reading Wikipedia pages and downloading articles and paying too much money for The Economist. But sometimes it's harder to research what the dynamic is like on the ground in a country and what are the big questions the country is asking itself politically, socially, economically that are likely to come up in debates. This is hopefully going to be an interactive session. I'm going to take you through a short talk where I talk through some of the important things to remember about Scotland, mostly focusing on the dynamics that are hard to research. But what I would really like people to be doing while that's happening is if people could be putting in the chat the kind of topics or motions that they are most curious about or feel that they have the most difficulty learning about on Scotland. Now, this can be motions you've seen before. This can be motions you've written yourself or topics that you know about or questions that you have. Because when we get to the end, we'll be able to do a little bit of a Q&A, and we're going to spend some time at the end of the session talking in particular about motions that we see often and what the dynamics are like in those motions when we see debates about Scotland. Now, my first question is, what do people think of when they think of Scotland? If people could put in the chat or shout out, what are the first things they think of? Scotland has a very strong brand internationally. So there are the S&P, rainy. I'm sure there are other things. We fried Mars bars, Scotch and golf, way ahead of me, Tarun. Hamza Yusuf, that's a very particular. Baby haggis. Scotland has a really strong brand. I'm putting up some of the things on the screen. I see in the chat sheep. Some of the things that come up when we think about Scotland's really strong brand. Now, like a lot of countries, Scotland has a complicated relationship with its international brand. Lots of countries and cultures all over the world have a complicated relationship with the culture they package up for the external world and the culture that they experience on the ground. And the question that is always the most useful from a debating perspective when thinking about particular countries or particular cultures is not what are these stereotypes and or not do people like them or dislike them. The most useful questions to ask are, where do these come from and how do people feel about them? Who is it serving? Who do these stereotypes, who are they useful for? When are they useful? When are they practical tools? When are they tools of constraint? Because like the question that comes up thinking about the strong brand Scotland has abroad is the first of all, that all of these things on the screen, many of the things people said is backwards looking. A lot of Scotland's brand, its tartan, its pipers, its Highlanders, its whiskey, its obsession with conflict with the English. All of this is historical, backwards looking, thinking about a country's glorious past as opposed to its future. And also lots of these things are about Scotland's geography, the environment, the physical locations in which people live. And when we try and understand a country, we have to think about it in its geographical context, both in the human geography sense, but in also literally where people live and how they feel and think about it. On the left-hand side, we have a map of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I'm not going to explain in detail the political construction of the UK. There is a very famous CGP Grey video that you can watch that explains what the United Kingdom is, what Great Britain is, and what Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland are. But the UK is a country made up of four nations. Now, many countries all around the world have federal states or self-governing regions or autonomous parts. In Britain, we call them nations just because of the history of how they have developed. And these four, in reverse order of population, are Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. Now, Scotland is quite geographically large compared to some of the other nations, but far and away, England is the most populous, the largest geographically, and the largest economically of all of the four nations. And you can see on the right-hand side kind of how Scotland breaks down by region, how Scotland breaks down in its kind of geographical and cultural sense, to give you a sense of where places are and what people are talking about when they talk about and think about Scotland. But one of the most important things to understand about Scotland in its geographical, in its human geography context, is its population density, its population dispersal. On the right-hand side, the numbers on these charts, on these maps, are from different censuses. So it's not about number accuracy, it's about the trend that this shows. On the right-hand side, you can see a map of the UK and its population density. So very light parts of the map have very low population density, very few people per square mile, and the darker parts have high concentrations of people per square mile. Now, you can see Scotland far and away has some of the lightest parts of this map. And you can see that even compared to England, which does have rural or less dense parts of the country, even the most rural parts of England have higher population density than the most rural parts of Scotland. And that England is far and away the most populously dense of all of the nations. And that Scotland's population, as you can see on the left-hand side, is extremely concentrated in very particular areas. This dark blue band across the center of the map on the left is in Scotland called the Central Belt. It is the social, economic, and political heart of Scotland, far and away compared to the rest of Scotland. The two major cities of the Central Belt have over 500,000 people each, and the next largest city in Scotland, Aberdeen, has less than 200,000. The difference here is significant. This isn't just a case of these are the biggest cities or that these are the biggest population centers. They are far and away the biggest population centers compared to any other part of Scotland. And in fact, if you look at a list of the 10 most populous towns and cities in Scotland, the vast majority of that list are actually suburbs of Glasgow and Edinburgh, the two major cities in the Central Belt. So Scotland's four biggest cities are Glasgow, here on the left-hand side of the Central Belt, Edinburgh, here on the right-hand side of the Central Belt, and then Aberdeen in the northeast, the oil center of Britain, where the oil in the northeast has its economic and industrial center, and then the post-industrial town of Dundee, also in the northeast. Most of Scotland's population live in one of these four places. And if you don't live in one of these four places, you live in a different part of the Central Belt and likely commute into Edinburgh or Glasgow for your economic life. But much of Scotland's brand, much of Scotland's historical concept, much of the things that people think about when they think about Scotland is not the economic centers in Aberdeen, Dundee, Edinburgh, or Glasgow. It is the very rural parts of Scotland in these very light blue in the Highlands and Islands, where people wear kilts and drink whiskey and eat shortbread and climb up mountains and it rains all the time. And that is where much of the branding for Scotland comes from, even though it's not necessarily the place where people vote in parliament or have jobs or make or do industry or live. So Scotland is a country often confused about its kind of social or geographic centers, or where it's the heart or soul of Scotland is compared to where most of its people are. But Scotland is not special. There's not something magically special or different about Scotland compared to other nations that have similar geographies. Scotland has many similar challenges as to other Northern European nations. It needs to face up to the challenges of climate change, to an aging population, to the ongoing energy crisis in Europe. There is oil in the North Sea, which travels through Scotland. And this is a continued challenge, both in the energy sense, but also in the climate change sense. And like many countries in Northern Europe, it also faces the challenge of a declining birth rate or declining population. You can see in the blue box on the bottom right, these are the projected populations of the four nations of the UK, all, for the next several years. And you can see that while England's population is projected to grow largely through immigration, Scotland's population is projected to stay flat. And you can see in the chart above it that this flat population is because of net migration. And the natural change in birth rate shows a declining population that is getting older. And compared to the other four nations in the UK, Scotland is by far one of the oldest. The average age of its population is much older than the rest of the UK. And so, how does a small, relatively unproductive, relatively industrial and agriculturally unproductive Northern European nation face up to the challenges of this decade, like many other Northern European nations? But also, Scotland has its own very particular challenges that are different than other nations in similar geographic positions. First of all, like much of the UK, but particularly in Scotland, Scotland is facing up to the challenges of deindustrialization of the industry of the UK. So this is, mining coal, making steel. These things were closed down and stopped in the 70s and 80s in the UK. In particular, this had an impact in Scotland because of Glasgow's history of industry in shipbuilding and industrial production, and Dundee's history as a textile production center. Now, very few parts of Western Europe make textiles or build ships anymore, and Glasgow and Dundee aren't special in that sense. But that means that these cities are wrestling with the history of persistent unemployment and poverty that comes in the wake of deindustrialization. Scotland also has significant health inequality and some of the worst health outcomes in Western Europe. People in Scotland die younger than any other country in Western Europe. The average life expectancy is 76 years for a man and 80 years for a woman. And this is going down. Over the last 5 years, the life expectancy in the UK has declined. But the life expectancy in Scotland in particular has declined faster than would be expected, despite the health improvements in technology and in medical treatments. But yet, Scotland's life expectancy continues to decline over time as opposed to go up. One of the symptoms of this persistent unemployment, poverty, and health inequality is Scotland's continuous problem with drug misuse, and particularly deaths from drug use. Drug deaths in Scotland per capita are higher than any other European country. You can see this on the bottom left-hand side, where although the total numbers of deaths may be relatively low, in 2020, we're talking in the low 1000s. Per capita in a country as small as Scotland, this is huge. And as you can see in the chart on the right-hand side, Scotland's drug deaths are increasing. There's a small dip since 2017, which is only to the good, but it is insane in a Western European country in which there is a strong healthcare system and a relatively decent safety net. It is insane to watch the number of drug deaths climb and not fall for year upon year. Now, there are particular reasons to do with Scotland's historical use of heroin and the heroin trade in the Central Belt. But this has also a lot to do with the persistent poverty in Scotland, in which there is the most deprived decile of the population. That poverty is very hard to move and very hard to change, and has now become endemic and accepted. The Glasgow effect is the name of the statistical fact that people in Glasgow die younger than any other part of the UK, and life expectancy there is the lowest and continues to go down. In Scotland, 20% of people live in poverty, and that number has not changed significantly over the last several decades, and in fact has spiked at different points. So Scotland's particular challenges around deindustrialization and health inequality are something that Scotland continues to wrestle with. So how does the country confront these challenges? These are challenges of politics, of how people make political decisions and choose to run the country. And I am going to take you for a whistle-stop tour through the political parties in Scotland. And to save you from the information that you could read a Wikipedia page about yourself, what I'm actually showing you here is how these parties divide up over two major categories, not just whether they are left or right. In Scotland, this is now somewhat left or right is now somewhat of a complicated question for political parties because one of the main ways in which voters divide themselves is over the question of the union with the rest of the United Kingdom, of whether these parties are nationalist, i.e., they are in favor of independence, that's why there's a Scottish flag next to it, or whether they are unionist, they are in favor of the continuation of the union of the parliaments, which is the relationship that Scotland has with the rest of the UK. So for this whistle-stop tour, we start with the most famous, potentially, the SNP, the Scottish Nationalist Party. The Scottish Nationalist Party have been in government in Scotland in the Scottish Parliament since 2007. They are extremely dominant and one of the largest parties in Scotland, but not in the UK, where they do not stand outside of Scotland. They're also the Scottish Greens. If you have been following the continued drama of UK politics, the Scottish Greens recently ended a coalition arrangement with the SNP. And the Scottish Greens, you would usually consider them to be to the left of the SNP and also a nationalist party in favor of independence, but in favor of independence in different ways and different manners than the SNP. We have a new entry into the field this year, the Alba Party, which are also a nationalist party and have a somewhat confusing left and right position, but are often found on the right of the SNP on social issues, and favor different approaches to the question of how to achieve independence. They are run by Alex Salmond, the former head of the SNP, who was gotten rid of, or well, he resigned and then sort of fell into disgrace and now runs the Alba Party. This ongoing election is going to be a major test for Alba because they have never actually had anyone elected. They have mostly benefited from defections from the SNP, so disgruntled SNP MSPs or MPs defecting to Alba. Now we come on to our unionist parties. These are parties in favor of staying in the union and staying part of the United Kingdom. The red rose logo here is the Labour Party. Now, in the UK, there are national parties, the Labour Party, for example, but they have particular wings that are active in Scotland. So this is the Scottish Labour Party, which has its own leader and takes its own positions on issues inside Scotland, and leads its own debate at the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. You can see this in the logo of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. You can see this in the logo of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, where they have their own leader in addition to the Liberal Democrat leader. The Liberal Democrats are also a unionist party and are traditionally found in the center of British politics. They are quite socially centrist and also economically centrist. And then at the very tippy top here, as in the most unionist and the most right, are the Scottish Conservatives. Again, the Scottish Conservatives have their own leader and also are underneath the leadership of the National Party. So Rishi Sunak is the leader of all of the Conservatives, but the Scottish Conservatives have their own leader. But then there are some questions here that you may have noticed I haven't mentioned. Some things that have been in the news recently. So big question mark around Farage's reform, who are standing candidates in Scotland, but have never run as a party before in Scotland. So big question mark about how they will do, and a big question mark about kind of where they are on many of these questions. And then also a big political question is Scotland's relationship with the EU. Britain's relationship with the EU is sort of an unspoken question in a lot of politics in the UK right now. And many of these parties take different approaches on what Scotland's relationship should be with the EU. There's a question. I saw a question in the chat that I think would be helpful to answer now when I'm actually on the politics slide, which is about how often the SNP have needed to form coalitions. This is a good question because the Scottish Parliament uses a different electoral system to the rest of the UK. Just for funsies, when they invented the Parliament, they wanted to make a special system, and so they used what is called mixed member proportional. There's a great video about, I think it is another CGP Grey video about this, which explains mixed member proportional, but essentially it is a form of proportional representation. Because it is a form of proportional representation, getting an outright majority in Holyrood, the name of the Scottish Parliament, is quite difficult electorally. You need to really dominate basically every kind of voting, the member votes. You need to be able to get a big geographic spread of votes. You need to get large proportion of the votes. It's very different than first past the post, where you can get, like 30% of the votes and really be the largest party. So the SNP have been in coalition or have had governing arrangements that are a bit looser than coalitions before. In 2007, when they formed a government, they were in coalition with the Greens, but tended to make financial vote decisions with some of the other large parties like the Conservatives and Labour in order to get budgets passed. And so they have been in coalition with the Greens before. However, the SNP really surprised much of the British political establishment in the late 2000s and in the 2010s by becoming extremely dominant, even in a system that makes it difficult to have a majority governance, in which for several rounds of government in Holyrood, the SNP had an outright majority and were able to govern on their own. The most recent coalition, for example, the SNP actually had very close to a majority, and the small number of Greens was able to finally complete their majority. So they have been in coalition before, and they have needed to do it several times before, largely because of the proportional system that is used at Holyrood. So, what are some of the big questions in Scottish politics? We're going to be coming on to motions in a second, so I really hope people have been thinking about motions, thinking about topics. But the overwhelming headline of many of the last decades of Scottish politics has been about the hangover and the continued interest in what is called the constitutional question, the question of what the Scottish Constitution should be like. Should it be an independent one, or should it be one that is part of the United Kingdom? In 2017, no, not in 2017. I don't know why it says 2017. It was much before, earlier than that. But in the early 2010s, Scotland had a referendum about whether it should become an independent country. The question on the ballot was just, should Scotland be an independent country? And the country voted much more closely than anyone was expecting. Only people living in Scotland could vote, not all of the United Kingdom. And these numbers have become totemic numbers in Scottish politics, the 55 to 44. 44% of the population, or 44% of the votes, vote yes, Scotland should be independent, and 55 say no. This was on a nearly 85% turnout, the highest recorded turnout for any election or referendum in the United Kingdom since 1910, when the UK introduced universal suffrage. So this was extremely high turnout for a vote in the UK, and was a time of extreme political interest, engagement. It really fired up the political question in Scotland. Many people who were living in Scotland at the time, and many Scottish people, will really describe this as a particularly intense moment in which many people's decisions were made about what kind of voter they were, not just whether or not they wanted an independent Scotland. It became a question of identity, of self, of how you defined yourself, of how you understood your position and your relationship in Scotland, was how you voted in the referendum. And the following from the referendum, there was a long period of extremely dominant SNP governance, in which the SNP continued to govern Scotland for many years after this. And this has started to change. Now, the SNP have been the incumbent party in Holyrood in Scotland for many years now. Since 2007, the UK has long governments, but this is quite long in terms of government in Scotland and government in a devolved authority. And it is now starting to seem like there is an incumbency effect. Polling around this current election shows that many voters who previously have voted SNP will now vote for someone else. And there has been many like rumblings and questions in the UK political sphere, in commentators, about whether this is a sign that the SNP's dominance is coming to an end. And it has taken a long time to get here. The SNP have had a checkered history of governance in which health outcomes in Scotland continue to be poor. It has had a checkered history of stability in which its coalition collapsed earlier this year and it changed leaders unexpectedly. The previous leader and her husband are being investigated for potential impropriety in the use of campaign funds, and this has started to create the atmosphere that the SNP are not the dominant party they once were. But this always continues to ask the question of whether devolution is working. Devolution is the term that we use in the UK to describe powers moving out of Westminster, the main parliament in Britain, to other parliaments around the UK, including to Holyrood, the name of the Scottish Parliament. And many people are not sure whether devolution works for them. By many people, I mean voters. Voters are not always 100% sure what powers that their parliament does have. They will sometimes vote in ways that are not necessarily logical. For example, the current election is to elect MPs to Westminster, not to elect MSPs to the Scottish Parliament. But many people, when talking about the fact they will no longer vote SNP, describe the SNP's history in Holyrood and their misuse of powers in Holyrood, despite the fact that not voting for the SNP in Westminster really has limited effect on that. So this is a big time of change for politics in Scotland, and will be really interesting to see what happens on Thursday. Now, this is where we hopefully get some interaction, some interactive time. I have chucked up lots of different motions that I have seen around Scotland. Some of these motions are less common than others because they are actually not that balanced and they are not that deep, but they are the kinds of topics we see come up over and over again. And the kinds of topics that we might see at Euros. I have no idea whether you will. But these are the kinds of questions that come up again and again when thinking about Scotland, but either as an example or as a particular debate subject. Obviously, independence itself does come up, but the fact I put this house supports Scottish independence, I mean it a little bit more as a joke. It would be very rare for you to actually get a motion that's just like yes or no on independence. They've been out of fashion pretty much since the referendum, and are very hard to do. But independence is going to come up again and again, and how independence should be campaigned for, how it should be campaigned against, comes up again and again. So whether you as the SNP would campaign for independence in a more aggressive way, would you hold a unilateral referendum regardless of permission from the rest of the country? Would you take a softer approach where you try and campaign for consensus? You know, you're seeing this as the project of lifetimes as opposed to the project of the next couple years. How should other parties approach independence? It's been a live conversation in the Labour Party for many years now about whether Labour actually really cares about independence. Labour is a left-wing, is an economically left-wing party and doesn't really care whether that economics is in Scotland or in the UK. Why does Scotland care about? Why does Labour care about whether Scotland is an independent country or not? And this has been a live topic in the Labour Party for many years about its kind of ambivalence about independence helps or hurts it. Also, the Scottish Conservatives tend to suffer or benefit as the National Party benefits or suffers. They struggle to establish their own particular relationship with voters in Scotland because they're seen as part of the National Party. And so, would it be in their interest to split away from the main UK party to try and rescue that tarnished brand? But would it also hurt them in depriving them of resources and cutting them off from the history of the most electorally successful political party in the democratic world? Um, Scotland also wrestles its long and checkered history with drug use, um, and wrestles with this in the context of a UK that has very conservative drug policies. So, for example, safer drug consumption facilities have been established in Glasgow to try and give people places where they can safely use drugs, where they can be treated by medical professionals if they overdose, where they can use clean needles. But this is illegal in Britain, and the people who have established these facilities have sometimes been taken to court for the fact that they are doing something illegal by facilitating drug use. The Scottish Parliament doesn't have a second chamber, and it functions. Devolution in the UK was done in a kind of piecemeal manner where powers were handed out bit by bit. And this doesn't mean that the Scottish Parliament functions in the best and possible way. Scotland also wrestles with other questions that I haven't answered here, which I haven't touched on in great detail. But the fact that Scotland's international brand, it's the Braveheart Highlander in a kilt who is constantly at war with the English. This is Scottish history from hundreds of years ago. And does the fact that Scotland remembers that as a glorious past rather than what it was, which was a miserable history of grinding poverty in a rainy, rocky, starving part of the world, does that help or hinder Scotland's development? Does that help or hinder Scotland's relationship with the rest of the world? In particular, Scotland's self-definition as kind of being oppressed by the English as this sort of, this colony or this, vestigial arm of the British Empire. How accurate is this when Scotland was not just an active collaborator in the project of empire, but a major beneficiary, where Glasgow and Edinburgh, these glorious cities of beautiful stone, are built on the money that Glaswegians and people from Edinburgh made trafficking in slaves in the Caribbean and selling sugar that they made off the backs of enslaved people? How does Scotland deal with a world in which we are not just oppressed or put down by England, but also part of a global hegemony that has majorly benefited Scotland? How does Scotland wrestle with this in a context where 20% of Scottish people live in poverty and Scottish people will die much faster than anyone else in Western Europe? This is the kinds of questions that Scottish people have to wrestle with when making political decisions, and are the interesting questions we ask when we set motions about Scotland, about a tiny country on the edge of the Atlantic that, like many other countries, has to wrestle with complicated and challenging questions about of how it will confront the next several decades. I will hopefully use my slides to go back and forth and answer questions, but I'm going to turn them off for a second so that I will be bigger on the screen and that's easier for me to see the chat. But I would really like to be asked questions to give information that is actually what you are looking for, as opposed to what I think you are looking for, and to also hear if there are motions or topics that you are curious about that you would like to understand a little bit more and go into a little bit more detail on. Okay, I'm starting to see questions already. Freddie, I'm glad you like my motion. Tarun, very good question. What does Scottish political culture look like? Is it hyperpolarized between pro and anti-unionist parties? Yes and no. It has tended to be a, a, a political conversation that is very focused around the constitutional question. And you are either on one side of it or you are not. Part of the reason for why the Labour Party fell so far back in Scotland in the late 2010s is that its position in the independence referendum was for unionism. And the place where the dynamism and the interest of young people, and many of the kind of thinking on the left went to in Scotland was nationalism. And so there is a polarization between pro and anti-union parties. The thing that has been really interesting to watch over the last 2 years, even less than that, over the last year, has been watching this dynamic tend to shift as the cost of living has bit, as the like as political opinion has swung so strongly against the conservatives. It has been interesting to watch Scottish people sort of seem to feel freed up to vote in new and interesting ways. A very interesting phenomenon that happens in British politics in general because of devolution, where people often have two votes, where they can vote for a local assembly and also the national parliament. Um, an interesting phenomenon that happens is that people will often not always vote the same way between those parliaments. So there has been a long-standing kind of stereotype trope in Scottish politics, which is, well, the SNP stand up for Scotland. The SNP are like who I want, making the like, you know, making the case for Scotland in Westminster. So I will vote for the SNP at Westminster, but I will vote for someone else at Holyrood because Holyrood is kind of, you know, it's I don't feel the same baggage I feel about it for Westminster, and because of the mixed member system, I can vote in a more proportional way. And so you often see a kind of split between this, in this belief that the SNP are the best party to represent Scotland, but not necessarily the party you want to give an overwhelming majority to in Holyrood. This has shifted back and forth at different times. Um, Interesting question. Which demographics form the traditional voter bases of the various Scottish parties? The demographics of Scotland have been in flux over the last several years, partially because of what I mentioned, deindustrialization. The Labour Party is exactly what it says on the tin. This was a party formed around the industrial unions in Britain. And Scotland, a country that is extremely rural, like the vast majority of the country, hardly anyone lives there, and the people that live in particular urban areas were focused around industry. Dundee and Glasgow and Aberdeen and Edinburgh were sort of labor heartlands. And then as deindustrialization happens, as those people lose their connection to their industrial union, as they lose their connection to this identification through employment, this is where the SNP is able to gain a lot of ground in these locations. In the demographics in Scotland tend to break down geographically and also by industry, which is also very geographic. For example, the Conservatives tend to benefit in farming areas, so very rural, in fishing areas, so on the coast, and in areas where people are particularly affluent. Labour tends to break down along industrial lines. But as those identities have been in flux, many fewer people work in fishing and farming than they ever did. The SNP have really gained ground in this sort of new Scotland that exists. I'll come on to your message in a second, Piotr, because I think it's a very interesting motion. But the last question is a very good one and a very challenging one. To what extent is Scottish national identity constructed in opposition to England, and how does this affect national politics? A very, very good question, and a question that Scottish people have been asking themselves for many decades. When Scottish people are polled on their belief around social issues, for example, when Scottish people are polled about um, what they think about immigrants, about how much they think should be spent on the welfare state, about how high taxes should be. Scottish people poll very similarly to the rest of the UK. There's not something magic in the water or in the air in Scotland that is making people like just mentally different. In general, Scottish people, when polled, poll very similarly to the rest of England, to the rest of the UK. However, if you poll Scottish people asking them how they are different from the rest of the UK, they will tend to say, we are more accepting, we are nicer, we are more welcoming, we like immigrants more, and we care more about what happens to poor people. So this question of comparison is in many ways the key, the heart, the diamond in the rough of Scottish politics, which is on defining yourself in distinction to the other. Mari Black gave a very interesting interview Mara Black is the deputy leader of the SNP at Westminster. She was one of the youngest MPs ever elected, and is resigning soon, on Thursday, I guess. And she gave an interview about how she thinks that Scottish politics will be normal again after independence. She's in favor of independence, and that she thinks the political project of the SNP is to cobble together this insane coalition of every different kind of voter, people who do not necessarily really share interests, into one coalition to make independence happen. And then when independence happens, that coalition sort of falls apart. You see this if in the leadership contest between Kate Forbes and Humza Yousaf. In many ways, an insane leadership contest for one political party to be happening. Because how do you look at that political contest and listen to those interviews and think that this political party has any coherent kind of platform? Because Hamza Yusuf is a socially liberal, urban living, child of immigrants who's interested in propping up the welfare state, to increasing the size of the welfare state, to a more aggressive transition to net zero, to a kind of, extremely socially liberal position. And his opponent, Kate Forbes, is an evangelical Christian who thinks abortion is wrong and that it was wrong who did not vote in favor of gay marriage, who's economically conservative, who is lives in a rural part of the country, identifies with agricultural voters. Like, these are the two representatives of the party and have very little in common, but they are brought together in this political project of independence, this political project of separation from the UK. So, how does it affect national politics? Is the question. The answer is that is national politics. Not necessarily in a sort of like Willie from The Simpsons, Braveheart kind of sense. Scottish people are like understand that English people are just also people and are not like some magical other. But Scotland has hundreds of years of culture that are about its relationship with England. And its relationship with England continues to be the major political question that all political parties are trying to answer. There was a really interesting question about a motion on whether it was in the interest of the Greens to run on the platform of a coalition with the SNP. So this is a really interesting question. Piotr, if you can put in the chat things that you thought were really particularly hard about this motion, I can try and talk about them. But the things I would think about as particularly like points of framing or context for that kind of motion is the system of the parliament at Holyrood. A mixed member proportional system means that it is very hard to get an overall majority, and therefore coalitions are likely. However, the UK does not have a long history of coalitions, and coalitions are very uncommon and weird. Um, uh, and so British people have a sort of strange relationship with coalitions. It isn't like Germany, for example, where coalitions are a really like accepted part of how government works. Um, and but on the other hand, on the other hand, the Greens and the SNP have a great deal of common cause. They are the two major nationalist parties that aren't kind of run by crazies. Alba has a sort of long history of what we might call nutters. Um, and so they have a lot of common cause. They have socially liberal connections. The Greens have a strong interest in dragging the SNP to the left, and the SNP have really made a lot of success out of socially liberal views. It says you were saying from Gov side, it seems hard. Why would you not say that it's a possibility or not take a hard stand? Well, I would think that one of the things that would be in your interest would be to drag S&P voters away from the party by saying you would definitely do it. So one of the like abiding things of British politics is as we get closer and closer to the polls, to the actual day of the election, people get less and less likely to vote for any of the parties that are seen as not the normal ones. And if you were the Greens, it would be strongly in your interest to say, no, it's safe. You can vote for us. If you're an SNP voter, which most of Scotland at this point is an SNP voter. The SNP have been in the majority for a decade plus. Most of the country is an SNP voter at one time or another. If you're a Green, it's strongly in your interest, if you're competing for the same kind of votes that the SNP candidate is competing for, to say, if you vote for me, you'll still get an SNP government. You'll just get one that's like a little bit snugglier and gets to net zero faster, and like I will be a key part of the SNP government. And it's also positive for those who don't want to vote Green because they think the Greens never like get anything done. Because if you're in coalition, you get cabinet positions, you get to put legislation through parliament. So that's why I would think it would be better than just being like, oh, we might do that, it's a possibility. And I think it gives you some strength in the in compared to when you'll get, I think, accused of you're going to do it anyway. So if you're a Labor candidate saying like, oh, don't vote Green, you'll get SNP, it's in your interest to say like, yes, do vote Green, you will get SNP. I am agreeing with you, like that. That's not a not something that is going to do any damage to you. Okay, so I'm seeing really good questions. What Owen's just said in the chat is also very helpful. Last Scottish election, there were literally posters saying vote SNP on one part of the mix. So in a mixed member proportional system, you get a couple different votes. One is at the constituency level, like who is your guy in your area, and then you get a regional list, which is like who's the guy from sort of around you, and that one you just vote for the party because they have a list. And there's been some successful campaigns in Scotland about splitting your vote between those two, about arguing for you to vote one way in one part of the vote and another way in another, in order to have like the most efficient vote spread. And so the kind of thing that Owen's describing, in which you vote SNP in one and then vote Green in the other, has been a successful strategy for the Greens. It's one of the reasons why the Scottish Greens are much more successful electorally than the English Greens, who the English Greens are dealing with the first past the post system, which is essentially impossible for a smaller party. Whereas the Scottish Greens have had great success using the Holyrood system to their advantage. I'm falling behind on the questions, but people are asking really good questions. What is the general attitude towards minorities from each party, not just the SNP? Is there a party standing out and being particularly liberal or conservative when it comes to the LGBT community, people of color, welfare for single mothers? So, in terms of racial minorities, a key element to understand here is that demographically, Scotland is extremely white. The UK is obviously like not the most racially diverse country in the world, but England is like quite racially diverse. A long history of immigration from the former British Empire. This has created a country that, especially in urban areas, is quite racially diverse. Scotland does not have that legacy, and the vast majority of the country, like 99% of it, is white. There is a tradition of South Asian immigration into Glasgow, and there's some crazy statistic, which is like if you aren't white and you live in Scotland, the likelihood that you're from like a 10-block neighborhood in Glasgow is like 90% or something like that. Because this isn't a very particularly racially diverse country we're talking about. Like many other Northern European countries, it's not very racially diverse. And so this means that in some ways, Scotland has not had to confront some challenges of more diverse countries that are dealing with confrontations between racial groups. On the other hand, it does mean that Scotland is not sometimes ignores its long history of racism. So many parties are able to take what I would describe as quite liberal stances that they then don't necessarily have to follow through on. The Scottish Conservatives are probably the party that I'd highlight as the most aligned with what we would call a socially conservative position. You know, they're skeptical of the benefits of immigration. But because the Parliament at Holyrood doesn't always have powers about immigration, parties at Holyrood can kind of take stances on immigration that they are insulated from. And in general, because of Scotland's low population, the parties are usually pro-immigration. And in the UK, just because if it's weird things, questions around racial minorities is often around immigration. Scotland has a very has an interesting position in the LGBT debate in the UK, where it has taken more socially liberal position. The Scottish government with the Greens and SNP have taken a more socially liberal position, especially on the inclusion of trans people, than the rest of the UK has, in particular the English Parliament. And it was, in fact, the Scottish Parliament's passing of a self-identification law for trans people that in some ways precipitated Nicola Sturgeon leaving the SNP. It wasn't necessarily the direct causal link, but it kind of precipitated the events that led to her to resign, and was a major confrontation point between a Conservative government that was anti-self-identification in Westminster and an SNP Green coalition that was pro-self-identification. This is a good example of actually how the positioning of the parties in Scotland puts Labour often in a complicated position, where Labour is also a socially liberal party that nevertheless needs to oppose socially liberal policies brought in by a Green and SNP coalition. This has often freed up the Conservatives on the right to be the distinct party of the socially right. So the more small c conservative position based on your questions. So it tends to be the Tories as the major party on the right are freed up to have the most conservative, small c conservative views. Like when I showed you the kind of four-way split of the parties, you'll notice that many of them are more crowded towards the left. The field of the socially liberal on the left in Scotland is more crowded. This does not always align with their economic policies. They're not always socially economically liberal as well, but certainly from a social policy perspective. How did Brexit affect Scotland's economy and political climate? Did Brexit perhaps bring some industrial jobs? Was Scotland really hit disproportionately? Did this equally affect all parts of Scotland, or was the effect stratified? Very interesting question. So it has different effects on the economy and political climate. Brexit has been bad for the UK economy in general, but Scotland's economy is particularly reliant on some of the things that Brexit has negatively impacted. So the UK in general is a service sector economy. It exports sectors like tech and financial services to the rest of the world. But Scotland does not do that. Scotland does not have a financial services sector. Really, Scotland does not export services to anybody. Scotland is a food producer. It exports whiskey and lamb and potatoes, and in many ways it grows food and agricultural products, or the drinks and food industry, and that has really significantly impacted all of the UK, where exporting has become much more difficult. There is some hope that there's a Brexit opportunity in providing services to other parts of the world. I do not think Britain has necessarily seen that anywhere, let alone in Scotland, and it is unlikely for industrial jobs to come back to the UK, really at any point. The impact on Scotland economically is in particularly those exporting sectors. Politically, the impact is very interesting in that Scotland, the vast majority of Scottish people voted to stay in the EU. It was actually mostly in England and for some bizarre reason Wales that voted to leave the EU. And this was a big kerfuffle afterwards, basically, in which people were saying, well, why do we have to stay in the UK if we don't even get to be in the EU, which we want to? And the Scotland in general has been much more pro-EU than the rest of the UK. What do Scottish people think about Wales and Ireland? Very good question. Scottish people do not really think about Wales, to be honest. This is Wales's perennial problem in the UK in general, which is that Wales is much, much smaller, and Wales doesn't have the same history of a parliament as Scotland does. So it does create a kind of different political discussion. And Wales is certainly seen as more culturally aligned with England, regardless of whether that's true. If you're Welsh and on the call, I'm sorry. but that's certainly sometimes how things are perceived socially. Scotland's relationship with Ireland is much more historically relevant and politically relevant, both its relationship with the Republic and its relationship with Northern Ireland. Um, Glasgow has a significant Irish immigrant population. Irish immigrant in the sense that they came over hundreds of years ago. Glasgow has a significant Catholic population, very associated with its relationship with Ireland and with Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is very geographically close to Glasgow, and many Northern Irish people come to Scotland or come to Glasgow to study, and there's much travel between these areas. That has created a history of sectarianism in Glasgow in particular, a sectarianism that is often mirroring the sectarianism of Northern Ireland. Celtic and Rangers are the two football teams that are the major representation of sectarianism in Glasgow, where Celtic is associated with the Catholic Irish population, um, and this is Irish in the ethnic sense as opposed to Irish in the national sense. Many of these people have not been from like citizen wise from Ireland for generations. And Rangers associated with the Protestant population, and this creates like conflict, usually over football games. Um, and what role does religion play in Scotland socially and politically? Football is the answer Freddie has given. It's also, yes, that is true. Scotland also has a unique relationship with Protestantism, in which Scotland has never had a government religion. So the England has a government religion. The Queen, now the King, is the head of the church as well as the head of state, and there are bishops in the House of Lords, and Anglicanism is the state religion. It is the religion of the government. The only reason that there like isn't like, I don't know, Anglican bishops running around everywhere is that Anglicans are kind of chill. But Scotland does have a long running relationship with what is called the Kirk, which is the Church of Scotland, and a particularly doom and gloom form of Protestantism associated with predestination, with the belief that God decided when he made the world, everybody that goes to heaven or hell, nothing you do on earth will change that. So you are either going to heaven and hell when you're born. There's nothing you can do to change that. The only way you know if you're going to heaven or hell is like whether you're a nice person, because the people who are like predisposed to being nice people are the ones that this will happen for. And this creates quite like a what in Scotland we call dour, so like quite doom and gloom religion. Many people in Scotland are not religious anymore, but similarly to many other Western European countries where the state religion has declined, that cultural phenomenon is still very in people's minds. And many of the stereotypes of Scottish people as miserly, as not liking to spend money, as kind of this like sad all the time. This has a lot to do with the long history of what is called Calvinism in Scotland. Yes, sorry, Jeremiah. What is sectarianism? Sectarianism is the name used for conflicts between Catholics and Protestants. Catholicism and Protestantism are sects, SECT, of Christianity. And so conflicts between Protestantism and Catholicism is called sectarianism, in which those sects are in conflict with one another. Northern Ireland is most famous when thinking about sectarianism, in that Northern Ireland had an ongoing civil war for many decades about the treatment of the different sects in Northern Ireland. But in the UK, sectarianism is both really associated with your religion, but like many conflicts about religion and about identity, it actually doesn't really matter how much you believe in your particular kind of religion. It also becomes an ethnic identitarian conflict, in which many people who are involved in sectarian conflict like probably haven't been in a church in years. It's also an identitarian conflict. Scotland sectarianism is usually talked about in the context of Glasgow, Scotland's biggest city. It's very uncommon for sectarian violence or conflict to be seen outside the city, in which there is much less Catholicism in the rest of the country. I think I've run through what are the key points Scotland does not have control over besides immigration and also some stuff related to drugs. So I would super recommend reading some resources about devolution. I will put some links in the chat because I have some different articles that are very helpful on Scottish politics and on devolution. So this is something that can be matter prepped, what powers Scotland has and what powers Scotland doesn't have. In general, Scotland's powers are domestic policy. So health policy is devolved to Scotland. So in the UK, we make a distinction between powers that are devolved and reserved. Devolved is when the Scottish government can do stuff with them, and reserved is when the power is reserved, held back in Westminster. So devolved powers include health, as one of the major ones. Education policy is also devolved, but things that are not devolved would be things like international relations. Much tax policy is not devolved. Because this is Britain and we always do things a bit complicated and weird, there are some particular tax policy that is devolved, and therefore the Scottish government can do some devolved powers on tax. But agriculture, housing, local government, transport, but not all of it. So for example, like buses are devolved, but air aviation isn't devolved. But things that are reserved are many elements of benefits policy in the UK. So who can qualify for benefits, employment law, energy, defense, national security, these kind of things, immigration. Here is a link to the Scottish Parliament website about what powers are devolved and what aren't. You will notice that the list includes things, it will say things like transport, brackets, some aspects, but this also has some more resources on the particular kinds of things that are devolved and aren't devolved. The history of devolution has been a kind of piecemeal operation where some bits and pieces have been handed off at different times. It wasn't like the Scottish Parliament was invented and was given a set of powers, and those set of powers have stayed static over time. This has created a political dynamic in which the SNP have always been arguing for more powers. They can always say like, oh, we don't have enough powers. We need more powers from Westminster to be able to fix all these problems that Scotland has that we have coincidentally not fixed in our many years of government. In like a lot of the time, they have then been given those powers through negotiation. So for example, when the Scottish Parliament was founded, no tax policy was devolved. And it has been recently, over the last several decades, that some parts of tax policy. What power do Scottish people care about most that they don't have? All the ones they don't have. Is the answer? No, that is actually a good question. So for a long time, taxation was a particularly totemic one that the SNP and many Scottish nationalists focused on, that it's impossible for you to be able to like take a particularly different approach as a government if you don't have tax powers. This is a bit facetious in the UK because the way funding is awarded to the different devolved governments is in proportion to its needs. It's called the Barnett formula. So I'm telling you the name so that you can look it up and read. You can like matter file on it if you really want to. But suffice it to say, the Scottish government gets given money from the centre, and for a long time it focused quite totemically on the lack of tax powers. I would say recently, there has been a great deal of focus about the parts of benefits policy that Scotland doesn't have. Immigration has also been one that the SNP have focused on. because Scotland is such a small country and its population is declining. The Scottish government and the SNP have often made the case that they would be in favor of greater immigration to Scotland, even when the Conservatives at Westminster have been like going hell for leather after trying to get immigration to go down. Um, in this current election, in one of the election debates, the SNP representative was the only member of the panel, like of any of the political parties, any of the major political parties, apologies, Greens, that spoke in favor of immigration um, when asked about how how the government should treat immigration. It was the SNP representative who said all of these people want to get immigration down, and we, the SNP, would like immigration to go up. How easy is it to get English citizenship / voting power within Scotland and vice versa? This is a good example of how weird the UK is. Scotland is a separate nation. It is not a separate country. Scottish people are citizens of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and they can therefore vote in England. You can completely move between the two countries. As far as the government of the UK is concerned, there is no difference between an English citizen and a Scottish citizen. There's no difference between a Welsh and a Northern Irish, or a Northern Irish and English. Like, we are all citizens of the United Kingdom and Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We just live in different parts of it. This meant that, for example, for the independence referendum, a decision had to be made about who could vote in it. And despite the fact that many people living in England would describe themselves as Scottish, and many people living in Scotland would describe themselves as English, Welsh, or Northern Irish, the decision was made it would be done exclusively on residency. So if you lived in Scotland, you could vote in the referendum, and if you didn't, you couldn't. Um, there, if you live in Scotland, the way you get voting power in a different part of the country is you move and you vote in a different constituency, but you don't have to do any paperwork to move. There is no such thing as English citizenship. The same way there is no such thing as Scottish citizenship. It is entirely inside people's minds. That was a super run through. This is not a dumb question at all, Tarun. Um, this is not a stupid question at all. This is a weird hangover from how the UK is divided up, and also how the UK has like interfaced internationally. So yes, football is at the Scottish, English, Welsh level. It is a fact that everyone lives with. It is kind of a debate sometimes because different sports treat it differently. Um, Most importantly, Scotland gets a WSDC team. Yes, true. So does Wales. I think Ireland have a united one. A good example of how this is treated is actually how Ireland has approached sports teams in general. So in the Six Nations, there is an Irish football team. There is an Irish rugby team. God, there's an Irish rugby team. The team are made up of people from the Republic of Ireland and from Northern Ireland. Those are two different countries. But it's because of the long-running conflict and civil war in Ireland that means a united team is a political project and a social and cultural project for many people. You know, the line where Northern Ireland is just a line in the dirt, and people on either side of the line feel like they are more or less a citizen of either country. Um, there has sometimes been arguments for um, dividing up teams that are done at a British level or conglomerating teams that are done at a nation level. A lot of the times, they are like this because of historical quirks. And for example, I think the reality of being the Scottish football team is that you're picking from a nation of 5 million people. You see this at the Six Nations, actually, which is that many of the rugby players very clearly have really never lived in Scotland. They have been able to claim Scottish citizenship or Scottish ancestry through some mechanism. So like Scotland and Wales are extremely small countries. Wales is even smaller than Scotland. So you're making your team from a nation of 5 million people, many of whom are malnourished. um, I think the questions have started to slow down. Um, People asked really, really good questions and very thoughtful questions about how debates like this work or what the dynamics are like in Scotland. Um, I would really encourage you to, when you're matter filing about a particular place, Scotland like this example here is Scotland, but any place that you are matter filing about, is to think the kinds of questions that have been in the chat about the dynamics and how people feel and have reacted to major events of the last several years. The UK is really in a moment of political change right now. Things are really going to change on the 4th, on this Thursday when the election happens. So we are all in the UK waiting with bated breath to see where we end up and what happens. So I hope that debates to this are very fun and interesting when they come in Euros. And I wish everyone the best of luck in Glasgow Euros. Please enjoy the city. Glasgow is one of the best cities in the UK. I'm not at all biased. So please enjoy your time there. Thank you, everybody, so much.